Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our first installment of Democracy and Vulnerability, hosted by the Vending Museum, Thomas Mann House, and Dublab Radio. My name is Lexi Tooley, and I'm so excited, along with my fellow student council members, to welcome Sophie-Charlotte Opitz to the program today. Sophie Opitz is a memory and media studies scholar and curator. She studied philosophy and art education at Goethe University Frankfurt and subsequently completed her doctorate. In 2019, she began her curatorial practice as a fellow at the Akademie Schloss Institute in Stuttgart, and afterwards worked internationally as a curator and director in museums in Germany, Switzerland, and England. She regularly publishes in academic journals, exhibition catalogues, and photography books, especially on aspects of collective memory cultures and global image politics. Sophie is also a 2023 Thomas Mann Fellow, and the Student Council had the pleasure of hearing her speak at the Villa Aurora and Thomas Mann House Conference, Arts in Times of Crises, and we are so excited to hear from her again today. Today's program will follow a 1-hour discussion with Sophie, moderated by Student Council member Amy Cabrales. We also welcome Sarah Abramson and Baruch Dix as new members of the Student Council. Sarah will write the blog post for the website of the Thomas Mann House, which will be up for viewing after this interview is posted. We'd also like to extend our thanks to Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for their generous support for this online and on-site discussion series at the Venda. Sophie, it's a pleasure to have you here with us this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining. Now I'd like to invite Amy to begin this discussion.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you here. A few of us, the council members, were lucky to see you present in November, so we're happy to have you back. Now the introduction is out of the way. I'm going to start our discussion with first question. What exactly is memory studies by your definition, and how do you use it as a method in your work?
Okay, thank you, Amy, and thank you for having me. And yes, I start with the question of memory studies, and it's a good one. So, I'm using the term, or when I'm using the term, I actually refer not to memory studies in a way of neuroscience or biology, but rather I relate to the social, cultural, political, and technological dynamics and shifts that affect individuals as well as entire societies. So it would be more precise, at least for me, to actually refer to it as cultural memory studies. And I think the core question of memory studies is really, how do we as individuals and societies remember? What influences our memory? What strategies, technologies, and materials do we use for remembering? But also, how do we forget? So as you can see, memory studies is not really about the past, but more about how we perceive the past. And with regards to the question of how I use it, so memory studies it's not a method, it's more a field of research, and in my case, a field of passionate interest, and because I really want to understand how visual cultures work and how they get shaped and influenced, and how they influence our world affairs. And maybe here I make a quick interruption on what visual culture is, if this is okay. So visual culture is all aspects and dynamics of culture that are expressed in imagery. So what does an image reveal about society? Why and how do we use certain images, imagery, and other not? What represents an image and what influences an image? So it goes vice versa. And maybe you can already feel or see that there's a deep connection between visual culture and memory studies and memory culture. When I was thinking of this talk, I was reminded by a quote by George Orwell, which I'm sure all of you know. It's who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. And I would like to add, who controls an image has a big advantage in controlling society. And many cultures are using images and visual objects for processes of remembering and commemoration. But the decision on what image of the past exists is a highly political question. So those who are in control can prohibit certain imagery or can only show the ones they want to show. And just to make one example, it's the case I mean, it's everywhere the case, but one very good example is in Russia, where only state-controlled, highly orchestrated imagery of the war in Ukraine gets broadcasted, and this influences the perception of the people and lets them remember the war as a successful necessity rather than a tragedy for both sides, or at least this is what is intended by it. So yes, I think this is exactly why I'm using it and why I'm interested in memory studies, because they really help to understand what, why, and how we see what it tells us about society and politics and what we can learn from it for the future.
Wow, that was a great answer. Thank you for elaborating on what memory studies is. I think it's also a very, very important tool, especially now that we have technology and we have different ways of telling our stories. And sometimes because there's so many voices, we don't know, what the real story is. And visual culture is often, very important and I would say accessible method to for an individual to just explain their story, explain their perspective. So I think it's very, very important to study. Our next question is a question about vulnerability by Sarah. So Sarah, whenever you're ready, you can ask Sophie.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. And thank you again, Sophie, for being here today. We're so excited for you to start off our 2024 series. And I just wanted to ask, since our theme this year is democracy and vulnerability, and you're our first speaker, I want to ask, how do you believe vulnerability, perhaps embodied by expressions of suffering or representations of the experience of violence, how do you believe vulnerability exists in collective memory? And as an extension of that, how can visual and performative expressions of vulnerability incite a collective response to injustice?
Memory or vulnerability, I see it like in two spheres or parts of when it comes to memory culture. And the first one is about the question how memory works. So a recall of an event depends on both the past and the present. And with regards to the past, the impact of an event is like very important. So if there's a high impact with regards to the emotional level, how much it touches you, your friends, your collective, the more likely you are all going to remember it. And with regards to the present, it's about activation, about accessibility, about the setting the recall is happening in. So there are like different things, different networks, which are very important for it. And again, it's about political decisions. So, for example, the question on the amount of memorials, for example, in public spaces is very important. And of course, the question, what gets memorized by the memorials? So what do they serve for? And moreover, the second thought on memory culture and vulnerability is that memory culture itself is very vulnerable. So memory is nothing that is just there. And even memorials that are made out of concrete and stone, that are present in the landscape or in the urban landscape, don't make any sense if you don't know what the history behind it is. So memory needs activation both individually and collectively, otherwise we forget. And I would like to make just one particular example of memory dynamics with regards to these vulnerable discourses. And what comes up in my mind is the history of queer people during World War II. And as you know, queer people got persecuted, abducted, and murdered. And while Jews were labeled with the Star of David, gay people were forced to wear a pink triangle as a sign. And in general, gay men and women at the time often had to pretend to be heterosexual and were living, whatever this means, and I make this now, normal lives in their families. So this idea of normal that equals heterosexuality made them particularly vulnerable. And after World War II, this perception of gay people persisted in society, and actually it was supported by the law. So you have to imagine the Nazi law that criminalized gay relationships persisted until 1969 in West Germany. And paragraph 175, which had said that men who engaged in acts of quote, unnatural indecency, end of quote, could go to jail, wasn't repealed until 1994. So it is no surprise that resentment, as well as feelings of shame and embarrassment, were shaping the discourse too. And this made it very difficult for society to remember their experienced injustices because there was almost no discourse happening in public. However, from the 1970s on, gay rights activists started wearing pink triangles as a sign of solidarity, and they remembered this fragile history. Moreover, the organization ACT UP, I'm sure you know it, it raises awareness about it started raising awareness for the HIV health crisis. They used the pink triangle as their logo. So by this, they reappropriate the sign from a sign of shame to a sign of pride. So this visual expression of vulnerability empowers by remembering what never should happen again.
Yeah, I think that was also a very great answer. Thank you as well for offering examples. I feel like that's a very clever way to be able to bridge understanding your concept and then applying it fully. Our next question is about collective memory, and it'll be asked by Baruch.
Hi again, Sophie. Very glad to be able to have this conversation with you. This is a very interesting concept and idea and study. My question has to deal with collective memory and thinking about collective memory. How do ideas, places, and people change as networks increase? And then a follow-up question to that, can collective memories ever be truly complete?
Okay, thank you, Baruch. Brilliant question. And I would like to start with your second question on the completedness of memory and collective memory. No, collective memory is never complete. And this is absolutely fine because a vivid memory culture lives from the gaps between different narratives, from interchanging thoughts, and from a constant recalibrating of the perspectives on histories. Moreover, the incompleteness creates space for the stories of those who have been overheard, oppressed, and silenced, as we had in the example before. So the fact that collective memory culture is always in flux is something necessary if we want to create a democratic memory culture. And with regards to your first question, I assume you're talking about digital networks. So there are quite a lot of interesting thoughts and theories on this change of memory culture. And I think the concept of the network memory explains the shift very well. So the network memory, it's a concept by Andrew Hoskins, who explains that the digital networks influence memory dynamics in 3 ways. And so first of all, in social networks, private becomes public and public becomes private. And this actually relates to your question on places and people. So secondly, not we decide what we collectively remember, but also the algorithm. And thirdly, no matter of past, present, or future, in the mediated network, there's one visual presence or present. So Hoskins explains that memory culture transforms from a culture of collectivity to a culture of connectivity. And I think this might answer your question.
Thank you for that, Sophie. There's actually a follow-up question related to this topic by Lexi.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, so along those same lines of collective memory, your Of Virtual Sit-ins article discusses the evolving relationships between AI and protest cultures plus democracy as well, and focusing on a shift from local issues to a larger global phenomena. And I was wondering how you think this transition influences the creation of a collective memory, especially considering the diverse global perspectives engaged in these various moments.
Yeah, thank you, Lexi. I think we have to understand that remembering means appreciating what happened. And as we have realized with the onset of AI and the way it is functioning, we really have to keep this in mind and keep working on representation within AI for the sake of democratic memory cultures. So when AI only reproduces already existing stereotypes because it gets trained to do so, then the chances are pretty high that we remember these stereotypes as well. So memories constitute an agency is both human and technological in this field and today. And at this particular moment, we still have a way to go to work on representation in AI, especially when it comes to counter narratives that got disregarded or silenced by master narratives. And in my opinion, here's the point where we need to work together, because if we want to mirror these diverse global perspectives, as you said, these perspectives should have a voice in creating and using the technology that is influencing memory dynamics, right? So we as a global society have to democratize technology in order to democratize memory.
Yeah, I like how you phrased that. I think it's very important, considering AI is still very new, and a lot of people want to utilize it, but sometimes it might not be for the best, and sometimes it might be for the best. So I think it's very important that access to AI and how we navigate AI is something that needs to be paid attention to. Changing gears just a little bit, going back to vulnerability, I wanted to ask you a question about democracy and vulnerability. We often think about democracy as dynamic and inclusive, but also messy and arbitrary, so positive and negative. Do you think that collective memory can also be seen as a dichotomous concept, as in, both positive, both negative? Because I sometimes see collective memory as a group, like you said, during World War II, there's groups that remember their suffering and their struggles, which is a negative thing. But at the same time, they use those memories for empowerment, for solidarity, for hope, for the future. So it's both positive and negative. Would you say that collective memory has that characteristic as well?
Thank you, Amy. Oh, yes, it does. All these frictions and tensions in memory culture gladly exist and are very important, in my opinions. The same applies to the so-called Streitkultur, that's a German word, in democracies, which is translated into constructive debate. So Streitkultur means constructive debate. And listening to your question, I have one example, which might be like a concrete event which relates to this question. So during the Argentinian military dictatorship in the late 1970s and early 80s, there were more than 30,000 dissidents kidnapped, tortured, and killed in clandestine detention centers. And the junta let its opponents literally disappear due to the belief that the disappearance would lead to processes of forgetting in society. But forced forgetting has the opposite effect. And just to make like a tiny experiment, like when I ask you to close your eyes and please do not think of a pink elephant. What's happening is that you think of a pink elephant. So prohibiting people to remember only serves to make their absence even more pronounced. And within their collective trauma and suffering, many Argentinians decided to exactly remember by highlighting the void in society, and that was created through the absence of those dearly missed. And there's one particular example which is for me still striking. So in 1983, there was a massive protest created, and in this protest there were life-sized silhouettes on paper of like bodies created, thousands and thousands at the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires. And you just have to imagine, like you couldn't see the city anymore because everything was full with these papers with the silhouettes of people who weren't there. And the sheer scope visualized the ubiquitous trauma in society. And at the same time, it was a powerful sign of hope and collectivity, and highlighting that those who are missed are not forgotten, that those who are there are suffering together. They are all like sitting in the same boat. They can share their grief. And I think this is maybe explaining in one example something to your question.
Yes, thank you for that. It just reminds me of the whole, even though it's a little bit cliche, the whole yin and yang concept that there has to be good in order for there to be bad, and that's just, you know, how life is and how life works with itself. Our next question will be asked by Baruch, and it mentions the relationship between memory and nostalgia.
Hi again. For many cultures, nostalgia can almost be a mystical practice that draws you into like the past for like the shortest of moments. In your studies of memory, how does nostalgia evoke the need for a collective memory? And does nostalgia play a role in the motivation for the creation of social networks?
Thank you, Baruch. Okay, nostalgia. I actually have to say that I'm not so much focusing on nostalgia in my research, but I'm happy, of course, today to respond with some thoughts on the role of nostalgia in social networks. So the concept of nostalgia definitely shaped the aesthetics of social media, especially in the early years of it. And I'm sure you all remember this grainy sepia-colored photo filter, which turned like digital photographs into these analogish photography from the 1940s images. And the reason for this, for sure, is to evoke sentimental feelings and to create an emotional bond with the social media platforms. By the way, maybe you have noticed it sometimes when you're scrolling through Instagram and you're like watching stories of your friends, you're watching reels. Sometimes Instagram is like putting your own story in it, created by Instagram. So you didn't do it, but like Instagram is proposing you to create a story, and in order to interact even more with their platform. And this is made because, or this is targeting your nostalgic feelings, because you suddenly you see an image which you may have uploaded 1 year ago, and you see it again. And this creates this feeling of nostalgia, which like creates the bond with the social network. Moreover, nostalgia helps people to escape from their everyday life. So on social media, people can distract themselves with nostalgic content. And this is really important, different to memory culture in general, because nostalgia glorifies past times. Memory culture in general doesn't. Or in other words, nostalgia does not evoke memory culture because it is a part of memory culture, but it's a biased part of it.
Thank you for that clarification. It just kind of clicked in my head, like, you know what, that's true. They're different, they're related, but they're different, because you're right, nostalgia usually is remembering the past in a good way, because I'm nostalgic for my hometown, or I'm nostalgic for this film I used to watch. So I think it is very related to memory culture, but it indeed is different. We're going to transition into a few questions regarding AI, and the first one will be asked by Lexi.
Thank you, Amy. Again, referring to your virtual sit-ins article, you touched on the potential risks and benefits of AI in the context of civil rights and liberties. How do you think that policymakers, activists, artists, and others can collaborate to influence the ethical development and overall diversity of AI technologies for the future?
Thank you, Lexi, for the question. And maybe I quickly explain the story about AI and diversity before I answer your question. And because I'm a visual culture scholar, I stick to the image generating AI, if this is okay. So first of all, AI creates no image, but you let create AI an image. This happens through so-called prompts, short explanatory texts. And I actually did one in preparation to this talk now on Stable Diffusion. It's an image generating program, AI program. And my prompt was young girl with a dog walking in the city. And the image I got was highly interesting for me. So first of all, the young girl I requested wasn't that young. It was more like a student. And she was light-skinned, wearing a tight jeans, a windbreaker, a knitted beanie, or to phrase it in another way, she looked super European. The entire scene was like staged in autumn. It looked like autumn with like yellow leaves in the trees. And she was walking an Australian shepherd-like dog on a cobblestone street that very much resembled Paris. And here we come to the problem with diversity. So why did Stable Diffusion produce this image and not another one? For example, of a younger girl with darker skin in another region of the world. So image generating programs get trained with millions of images from image databases. And these image databases consist of mostly internet archives. So this creates the first problem with regards to diversity, because the visual culture of the internet is a product of our world that mirrors all the stereotypes, biases, and hegemonies of the world. And all of them get transferred into AI trainings data. These images, again, get labeled and tagged with certain words that translate the visual in some textual interpretation. So this is happening because there has to be some link between what you're typing in as your prompt, and it has to make sense for the AI with the image making process. And the label, the word which is connected to the trainings data, is exactly what helps AI to create something out of your prompt. And for example, I mean, talking about labeling, I would love to know how many images of light-skinned people get the label migrant. And I'm sure it's not so many, you know? So anyway, you see there are two problems for diversity in AI, the trainings data and the labeling. And this is where policymakers, artists, and others can influence technology. So artists, for example, highlight in their work the biased nature of AI, and by this create visibility for the problem. For example, Ari Melanciano shows in Synthesized Identity her self-portrait, which gets altered by prompts like wild, successful, old, black, like many prompts. And the algorithm manipulates the artist's face, reproducing social stereotypes and Western patterns of perception. So policymakers and activists, again, can work together to create diverse trainings data or to educate about trainings data sets and labeling.
Thank you for that, Sophie. Sarah has a question also related to artists and activists and their role in AI.
Yeah, I mean, just to continue on the topic of diversity and discrimination in AI and its origins and internet archives that really essentially reflect our world. In your article, again, of Virtual Sit-ins, you wrote about ChatGPT's bias regarding the question of Israeli versus Palestinian freedom. And then later in that article, you mentioned projects like Carolyn Cinder's feminist data set, which imbues an AI program with a more social justice-oriented framework. I wanted to ask, what are some other instances of discriminatory patterns observed in AI, and what proposals do artists and activists have to confront such responses, which are undoubtedly a product of our own culture?
Thank you, Sarah. Great question. Okay, so another problem with representation happens when there is no material or visual memory content of specific discourses. And a brilliant example of an artwork that deals exactly with this problem is a work by Pablo Lerma with the title A Visible Story, a Possible One, an Invisible Story, an Impossible One. And Pablo explores how AI can generate images of gay romantic relationships that were a secret and never got visually recorded or registered by a camera. And this is already like where the problem starts, because AI therefore cannot create something as well, because there's no like visual content existing of it, but it tries to do. So what happens is that the image generating program hallucinates how it could have been, but with flaws and mistakes and glitches. I mean, how shall AI visualize the concept of, for example, impossible love? And Pablo is exactly prompting this. This is his prompt: impossible love of two gay men. And so with these photographs, not photographs, with these images he produces with AI, Pablo's work helps understanding that these invisible discourses are real and present, but kind of fall out of the mechanisms of representation by AI. And another discriminatory pattern I thought would be nice to talk about is human labor behind AI. And there's one brilliant work by a collective of artists and programmers, and actually one of them is Carolyn Sinders again. It's called TRK. It's an abbreviation for technically responsible knowledge. And the work addresses the injustices within Mechanical Turk. So what's Mechanical Turk? Mechanical Turk is an Amazon marketplace for the completion of virtual tasks that requires human intelligence. So for example, categorizing, comparing, transcribing data. And, like people all over the world can do these micro tasks and get some pennies after completing each of these tasks. But TRK is actually designed as a wage calculator. And you can calculate how much money someone gets for labeling thousands of photos and if the salary hits the living wage. And as you might imagine, it doesn't, because the salary is usually ridiculously low, but it is like works like the TRK that increases the awareness of it.
Right, thank you for offering those examples. Lexi has a more abstract question to ask you now.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, this is a very broad question, but based on everything you said, I was curious of whether or not you feel hopeful about the future of AI.
Oh, wow. Sounds so simple, but it's so complex. Yes and no. I mean, the creators intentionally or unintentionally miseducating society about the mechanisms of AI when it started to become a thing. But there are so many activists, artists, programmers, policymakers, and so forth and so on, who educate about AI, and by this tear down the walls between those who understand AI and those who don't. I mean, I don't mean by this that everyone becomes a programmer in close future, but I really hope that at some point people, for example, might know that an AI-generated image is no photograph, that AI's response to prompts is based on already existing data, that the products we get from image or text generating AI do not mirror our world, but dominant patterns of perception. I also hope for ethical standards how to create and use AI. So I guess I don't feel hopeful about the future of AI, but rather I hope for the future of AI.
I like that wording as well. I think that's very true. I think a lot of people confuse it. I myself confused AI. I thought it was, just a photograph, but no, it's a result of a prompt. And then that is also limited because every database has different, archives, different access to these archives, and that can also cause a problem. So I agree with you. I hope that there is a future for the AI and that it's a positive one. Our next question is from Sarah, and it's going back to collective memory and its relation to protests.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, well, in this conversation, you've had some great examples of significant historical examples of protest art. For example, in Argentina with the life-size silhouettes in the Plaza de Mayo, I think you said, and representing the missing dissidents. And just to expand on these instances and further relating to your studies in collective memory, what historical protests and movements do you think live on in the memories of protest artists today, having paved the way or maybe having revolutionized protest strategies?
Great question, Sarah. I think historical protests influence future protests by their tactics and strategies, tools, and imagery. So, for example, the peace sign is a common symbol for protest and in many different protests all over the world. the hand signals that Occupy Wall Street protesters used to signal consensus derived not only from sign languages like ASL or PISL, but also from protest movements that did that before. And I think a very good example for your question is the history of the sit-in. So starting with Mahatma Gandhi's concept of civil disobedience, the sit-in too is a peaceful form of protest and informed by Gandhi's concept. And when four Black students from North Carolina sat down at a Woolworth lunch counter in 1960, they not only protested against racial segregation and discrimination, but also started a massive grassroots movement in the entire USA. And maybe you know it from history books, like they were everywhere, sit-ins happening in the USA with regards to the civil rights movement. And since then, sit-ins are a common tool in protest and protest cultures that actually evolves with society, technology, and media. What I mean by this is one example, for example, the electronic sit-in since the 90s. It's a form of protest where masses of people access websites in order to shut them down due to the massive traffic that is created by it. So this is another form of sit-in. And the newest development are in-game sit-ins, which happen in computer games like World of Warcraft, Animal Crossing, and Grand Theft Auto. And these again are a product of our zeitgeist, because, for example, there were a lot of in-game sit-ins happening in 2020, Black Lives Matter sit-ins due to the murder of George Floyd. And this was happening simultaneously to the pandemic, which was in the world. So a lot of people couldn't attend any protests. And this idea of the in-game sit-in was a great one, because everyone could do this, no matter if your immune system is working or not, you know, or if you are prohibited to protest in the streets, you could do it there. Yeah, so maybe this is, answering your question.
Thank you so much, Sophie. There's another question that came about. How do you see collective memory work among former East Germans who sometimes express nostalgic feelings towards their former state?
I didn't understand you. Sorry, say it again.
Okay. How do you see collective memory work among former East Germans who sometimes express nostalgic feelings towards their former state?
How do I see it work?
Yes, how does collective memory come about amongst this population and community?
I mean, I think nostalgia is a powerful tool for the activation. That's the first thing. I mean, it makes sense for me to think of especially East Germany as like a region which had quite a tough time during the Cold War, to use nostalgia for the memory culture, because it is a way to cope with a lot of suffering. And on the other hand, we shouldn't forget that the idea of East Germany was only a bad place is a lie. It's not true. And there were amazing people and amazing concepts happening. And again, I think that nostalgia helps to be cheerful about the past. And yeah, this is happening there.
Yeah, I think that's very important, just to remember that collective memory has, you know, both positives and negatives, and that visual culture is able to reflect that, and that we have to give that chance for that visual culture to be reflected. There's another question by Lexi about more positive examples about AI or activism, because I feel like sometimes we focus a little too much on the negative, but there's also a reason to focus on positive sides to it.
Awesome. So along those lines, could you describe some more positive or creative examples of how to use AI for activism or art?
Positive examples. I mean, seriously, I think all of them are positive, though they are maybe critical. I think it's amazing what they do, because they can shape awareness of the technology as well as of other things. But one example I have with regards to like a positive, how do you say, like twist in it. Let me, I just have to think, because I have several in mind which one I take. There's one artist, her name is Computational Mama, and she is doing workshops which they call renegade approaches to AI art. And she is doing workshops for all who want to have one, where she is not creating an artwork, but she is educating people how to do your own AI art. And by this, she's really focusing on exactly this, what we talked about today, that you are aware of the tensions, of the problems that are there, but also about the potential that AI has. And I can recommend like everything from Computational Mama, because she is really, really, really helping to educate society on this topic.
It's great that there's you know, people out there who are using their power to, you know, have workshops in this way. Next question will be asked by Baruch.
Apart from taking charge of AI, what other strategies do you think would be effective in defending democracy?
In what?
Oh, in defending democracy.
In defending, sorry. Ah, wow, we have so many strategies and tools we can use. And I mean, first of all, collectivity is really a tool we should use, and to listen. I mean, this sounds a little bit cheesy what I'm talking about, but it's true. Like, really, if we live what I said before, this German strange word, Streitkultur, like constructive debate, if we let it happen, I think this is like our most powerful tool. On the other hand, I think culture, art, all these like happenings where we can work together, be together, are really, really important for us to, yeah, to strengthen democracy. Music, super important. And another very important tool, I think, and this is where we have to work on, or what I'm thinking of, is accessibility to the discourse and the discussion. So there are a lot of people who might be critical about democracy because they feel they are not part of the discourse. So really, like, opening up in whatever way is important.
Yes, I agree. I wanted to touch back about your methodology and what you center your work on. Your project description on the Thomas Mann website states that you want to explore transnational image strategies that place hope as a democratic principle of action at their center. And I wanted to ask, why did you choose to focus on hope specifically?
Thank you, Amy. Well, I focused on hope because hope is really what we need right now. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about optimism. Optimism is hypothetical and passive. Being optimistic means to think, oh, I'm sure it's going to be okay. But being hopeful means I'm convinced there's a possibility to change things. So I define hope as something that creates agency. And I refer to Rebecca Solnit with this, who describes that the future is uncertain, but that hope cherishes this fact and creates space to act. So instead of just thinking, oh, well, okay, I accept the situation, hope gives agency. to reflect, to discuss, and to start the change. So this is why I chose to focus on hope.
Yeah, I like that distinction you make between hope and optimism, because hope does give agency, and there's a difference between saying everything will be okay versus I know it is possible for things to be okay in the future. This is another question. Do you think that AI constructing its own realities make it easier for the populist politicians to bend the truth?
I don't think that AI creates its own reality, but yes, I think you can instrumentalize it for certain things. And I see a big problem in the education about AI. And this is like, because a lot of people have no access and therefore no knowledge to AI, they might get misinterpretation of things. And that's always great for populist people, because if your audience has no clue what you're talking about, you can talk bullshit. And this helps people to create some whatever myths of the world. And so yes, I think it's a tool for them, but of course it's a tool for us as well. I mean, everyone can have it. The only thing that we really need to educate each other on this topic.
Yes, thank you so much for that answer. We're gonna have just one last question, and it is about the relationship between collective memory, both between on art activism and in truth. So Baruch, may you ask that last question, please?
All right. How can artists and activists call upon people and highlight the importance of a collective memory? And a follow-up question to that is, could art and activism exist without the access to collective memory? Or does a collective memory ground art and activism in like some universal perfect human truth?
Thank you, Baruch. I guess artists and activists highlight the importance of an active collective memory culture already by their practice and by being critical against established structures. And with regards to your follow-up question, this is actually difficult for me to imagine, this idea of no collective memory culture, because every individual is part of collective memory culture and therefore influenced by it. I mean, your idea sounds a little bit like giving Victor of Evreux. I don't know if you know him. He's like a French feral child who got found in the 19th century in France and couldn't speak and had like no connection to society. So this is a real story. To give like Victor a painting brush and let him create art. But seriously, there aren't a lot of stories like this of Victor, who grew up isolated from society. So yes, collective memory culture grounds art and activism.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sophie, for joining us today. It was a very interesting topic. I had never really, thought about collective memory in terms of art and how it can be used to uplift voices, and whether some voices are sometimes not uplifted. So thank you so much. We're looking forward to seeing more about your work. Thank you for the conversation. Our next speaker will be February 21st, and it will be Fridziman Karir, who will be a journalist and writer talking about civil disobedience and protest cultures. We'd like to thank our audience for joining in, and we will see you next month. Thank you.